The timer on my phone read 3 hours and 42 minutes, but I knew it was longer than that. I had been sitting on the cold tile floor of the guest bathroom for almost 4 hours, wearing my engagement dress, which was a pale pink color I hadn't even wanted, and staring at a pregnancy test that had already told me the truth 3 times. The air in that bathroom smelled like the eucalyptus and mint diffuser my future mother-in-law, Patricia, had placed on the vanity when she redecorated the room I was staying in because she said guests deserve tranquility. Tranquility. That word felt like a joke now. The test was positive. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the date on the test, the date of conception, which was approximately 2 weeks after my fiancé, Julian, had left for a business trip to Singapore. 2 weeks after he had supposedly been alone in a hotel room with nothing but spreadsheets and room service. 2 weeks after he had sent me a photo of his sad-looking dinner and called me before bed every single night. I had spent every day of that trip missing him. I had counted down the hours until his return. I had planned a welcome home dinner with candles and his favorite steak. And he had come home smiling, kissing me, telling me he had missed me, asking about the wedding. He was excited about the wedding. He had no idea I knew what I knew now. The test was the 3rd one I had taken. The first 2 were hidden in the back of a drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, because I wasn't ready to admit the timing didn't work. But you can't unsee a date. You can't uncalculate a due date. You can't look at the calendar and pretend the math doesn't tell you something you don't want to hear. I was pregnant, but I hadn't seen my fiancé in almost 3 weeks before he came home. I was carrying a baby that could not possibly be his. The problem was, I hadn't been with anyone else. I had been home. I had been planning floral arrangements and taste testing cake options and folding napkins into shapes I had watched on YouTube tutorials. I had been the picture of a devoted bride. Julian had been gone for 16 days. I was 7 weeks pregnant, which meant I had conceived during the exact window of time he was 12,000 miles away. I sat on that floor and let the math run through my head over and over, hoping it would somehow change. But numbers don't change. Dates don't change. Facts don't change, even when you wish them away. I thought about telling him. I thought about how he would look at me with those trusting eyes and ask how that was possible. He would ask, and I would have to tell him I didn't know. And he wouldn't believe me. How could he? I had nothing to offer but confusion. I had no explanation, no memory, no missing hours that would make sense of any of this. I only had a positive test and a timeline that destroyed everything we had built together. 2 years of planning. 2 years of love. 2 years of thinking I had finally found the one person in the world who saw me clearly and wanted me anyway. And now this. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. I couldn't even whisper them. I just sat there on the bathroom floor, staring at my own reflection in the mirror across the room, and I saw a stranger looking back at me. The wedding was only 37 days away. Everything was paid for. The invitations were sent. The venue was booked, and the deposits were non-refundable. Patricia had already told me that her family expected an elegant affair, and she had also told me, in that warm, polite way of hers, that her family was watching me. She said it was her job to make sure I was ready for that kind of scrutiny. I had always thought she was just a controlling mother-in-law who cared too much about appearances. But sitting there on that floor, I started to wonder if she was trying to warn me about something else. She had asked me a few weeks before Julian's trip if I was sure about this pregnancy timeline. She had asked with a smile and a harmless laugh, said it was silly to think about, but she had seen so many weddings fall apart. I had dismissed it as her being paranoid. Now I realized Patricia wasn't paranoid. She was suspicious. And maybe, just maybe, she had been right to be suspicious. Because someone had been inside my body, and I had no memory of them being there. That's when I started to feel afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding. If I didn't remember it, and I didn't consent to it, then something had happened to me. And when I thought about it that way, the fear was so large I could barely breathe around it. I started to piece together the strange fragments of that week when Julian was away. I remembered a Friday night when I drove home late from a fitting and stopped at a pharmacy for painkillers because my head hurt so badly I could barely see. I remembered the clerk asking if I was okay because I looked pale. I remembered waking up the next morning with a bruise on my arm I couldn't explain. I had assumed I was clumsy. I had assumed I just bumped into something. I had been so focused on the wedding details, so consumed by color swatches and seating charts and the perfect song for the first dance, that I had let everything else slide into a blur. But now the blur was coming into focus, and I didn't like what I was seeing. I finally stood up from that floor and walked into the main suite of the house. The house I shared with Julian, the house we had bought together in his name because my credit wasn't as good. And I felt like a stranger in my own life. I called my sister, Sasha. She was the only person I trusted completely. Sasha had always been the pragmatic one, the one who saw through people's masks, the one who warned me when I was being too trusting. I had ignored her warnings for years because I wanted to believe in people. I wanted to believe Julian was different. I wanted to believe his family was just protective. But now I was calling her at almost midnight, and she answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for this call. She had been expecting something to go wrong because she had told me something felt off about Julian's mother months ago. She had told me to look closer. I had told her she was being cynical. Now I was the one with a positive pregnancy test and no explanation. Sasha listened to everything I had to say. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't tell me I was overreacting. She just let me spill the whole mess onto the phone. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for so long that I thought she had hung up. But then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said, "Lily, I think you need to go to the hospital. I think you need to tell them you have no memory of that night. I think you need a rape kit." I couldn't even answer her. My throat closed up, and the words wouldn't come out. But deep down, I knew she was right. Something terrible had happened to me, and I had been so busy planning a wedding, so busy trying to be the perfect fiancé, that I had ignored the warning signs. I had let myself be distracted by flowers and cake and beautiful centerpieces while someone had taken something from me without my consent. And whoever did it, whoever they were, they had left behind a baby. A baby I would have to decide what to do with. A baby that would change everything. The hospital visit was the hardest thing I have ever done. The staff was kind. They were gentle. They asked me questions I didn't want to answer. They took samples and filled out forms and kept telling me I was brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt broken. I felt like someone had ripped me open and I was only now noticing the wound. The results came back a week later. The DNA was obtained. There was a match. The match was Julian's older brother, Miles. Miles, who had been at the house that Friday night. Miles, who had stopped by to drop off a wedding gift and have a glass of wine. Miles, who had mixed me a drink and then left before I fell asleep. Miles, who lived in a different state. Miles, who had no reason to be in my house except that his mother had asked him to check on me because she was worried I was working too hard. Patricia had sent him. She had told him I looked exhausted and she wanted him to bring me something calming. She had handed him a bottle of wine and a key to the house. And he had come and he had poured me the drink, and I remembered drinking it and feeling so drowsy I could barely keep my eyes open. I remembered him helping me to the sofa because I said I needed to lie down. I remembered nothing after that. But the test didn't lie. Neither did the DNA. Miles had been inside me. Miles was the father of my unborn child. Miles was the brother of the man I was supposed to marry in 30 days. I didn't tell Julian right away. I couldn't. I was too ashamed. I was too confused. I was too afraid he would believe I wanted it or that I had somehow led his brother on. Patricia had built a narrative around me. I could feel it. She had been planting seeds for weeks. She had been asking about my schedule. She had been asking about my memories of that weekend. She had been trying to make me doubt myself. And now I understood why. She knew. She had to know. She had sent Miles. She had set this whole thing in motion. And she had been watching me ever since, waiting to see if I would figure it out. waiting to see if I would become a problem she had to solve. I didn't know what to do with any of that information. I was reeling. I was drowning. The most terrible part was that I still loved Julian. I loved him so much it hurt. And I didn't want to destroy him with the truth. But I also couldn't lie to him. I couldn't marry him knowing I was carrying his brother's child. I couldn't spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't know what I knew. And I couldn't trust his family ever again. That was the thing that broke me. They had looked me in the eye at every family dinner. They had smiled and held my hand. They had told me I was one of them. And then they had done this. The wedding was still on the calendar. The vendors were still ready. The guests were still expecting a celebration. Patricia called me 2 days after the hospital visit. She asked if I was having second thoughts. Her voice was so smooth, so rehearsed. I knew she was testing me. I knew she was trying to see if I was going to crack. I told her everything was fine. I told her I was just exhausted. She offered to help with the final arrangements. She offered to take over some of the burden. I thanked her. I told her I would be okay. And then I hung up the phone and I looked at my reflection and I didn't recognize myself anymore. The woman in the mirror was a woman who had been betrayed in the worst way possible, and she was standing in front of a cake-tasting schedule like nothing had happened. I looked at that schedule. I looked at the list of flower vendors. I looked at the seating chart, and I realized I wasn't just planning a wedding anymore. I was planning something else entirely. I started to go through Julian's computer. I had never done that before. I had always trusted him. But if Patricia knew what happened, then Julian might know too, or at least suspect. And I needed to know what he had been told. I found his email archives. I found messages between Patricia and Julian dating back months. The first one was from before Miles visited. She had written, "I'm worried about Lily's stability. She seemed scattered. Have you noticed anything off?" Julian had replied that I seemed fine, just tired from planning. She had written back, "Sometimes people hide things. I just want to make sure she's not having a breakdown." The messages continued. Patricia had been planting seeds of doubt for months. She had been trying to make Julian question my mental health. She had been setting the stage for a breakdown narrative. And now I understood why. When I came forward with the truth, she would say I was unstable. She would say I was imagining things. She would say I had fabricated it because I was jealous of Miles or because I regretted the pregnancy. She had prepared for my accusation. She had made sure no one would believe me. I kept reading. I found an email from Patricia to Miles. She had written, "Please handle Lily. She is making things difficult with her demands. I need you to help me quiet her down." Miles had replied, "I'll take care of it." That was it. That was the evidence. 2 sentences that changed everything. They weren't just dishonest. They were conspiratorial. They were criminal. And I had the messages in my hands. I saved them to a secure folder. I made copies. I forwarded them to my attorney. And then I sat down and I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. The man I loved, the man I was supposed to marry, had a brother who had done something unforgivable, and a mother who had planned it. And I had to choose. I had to choose between telling Julian the truth and watching his family destroy him, or keeping the secret and living a lie forever. Neither option was acceptable, but I had to pick one. I decided to confront Miles first. I called him and said I needed to speak with him alone. He acted surprised. He acted innocent. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I knew. I told him about the DNA. I told him about the test. I told him about the bruise on my arm. And then I heard silence on the other end of the line. Long, heavy silence. He said, "Lily, I think you're confused. I think you're stressed. I think the wedding has gotten to you." I would never. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. His voice was too smooth. It was the same voice Patricia used when she told me I was imagining things. I realized then that Miles and Patricia were a team. They had been working together from the beginning, and they had no intention of admitting anything. They had no intention of taking responsibility. They were going to deny everything. They were going to make me look crazy. And if I didn't have proof, they would win. But I did have proof. I had the DNA. I had the text messages. I had the timeline. And I had 3 weeks before the wedding. I didn't tell Sasha my plan. I didn't tell anyone. I just started making calls. I started gathering documents. I started building a case that would expose everything. And I realized that the wedding wasn't a celebration of love anymore. It was a war zone. I had to walk into that war zone armed with facts. I had to make sure that when I revealed the truth, no one could spin it. I had to make sure that Patricia couldn't gaslight her way out of it. The morning of the wedding arrived. I had barely slept in 3 days. I had been running on anger and adrenaline and the desperate need to be heard. I stood in front of the mirror in my white dress, not the pink one I had originally chosen, but white because I was done playing their game. Sasha was with me. She had agreed to be my maid of honor, but I hadn't told her what was about to happen. I couldn't. I had to do this alone. I walked down the aisle. I saw Julian's face. He looked so happy. He looked so in love. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to stop everything. But I kept walking. I kept my eyes forward. I kept the folder close to my chest. The officiant asked if anyone had an objection. Patricia smiled. She thought she had one. But I raised my hand. I said, I object. The room went silent. Julian looked at me like I had just stabbed him. I opened the folder. I showed the DNA results. I played the voice recordings of my conversation with Miles. I read Patricia's emails. I told the room what had happened to me. I told them I was carrying my fiance's brother's child. I told them his mother had orchestrated it. And I watched Julian's face crumble. He didn't look angry. He looked destroyed. He looked like he had just lost everything. He looked at his mother. He looked at his brother. And then he looked at me. He said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The room erupted. People were screaming. Patricia was shouting. Miles was trying to leave. Security had to hold him back. And I just stood there in my white dress, shaking, crying, holding the truth like it was my only lifeline. The wedding was over. My relationship with Julian was over. But something else had just begun. Something I hadn't expected. Rebuilding myself. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know if I could ever heal. But at least I had made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else like they had hurt me. At least I had made sure the truth was in the room. That was the one thing they couldn't control. That was the one thing I had taken back from them.